We're beginning chapter 15, Chalk and Cheese. The world would have little need to take note of Wally Hillard and Rudy Deckers were it not for the fact that their purchase of Huffman Aviation for an undisclosed sum in June of 1999 set in motion a chain of events that ended in tragedy. It was their business decision, which 16 months later resulted in people hanging at dizzying heights out of windows high above New York. Atta's Hamburg cadre and the Arab terrorist bombers of the early 1990s, several of whom also attended flight schools in the U.S., clustered in a handful of flight schools. The terrorists didn't have complete and unfettered access to any U.S. flight school they pleased. They were funded through only a few special schools, the Magic Dutch Boys, airmen in Oklahoma, and a couple in Arizona and California. The so-called 20th hijacker, Zacharias Mossowai, who also has links at Venice Airport, spent 3 months at Airmen and everything was cool. When he showed up at a flight school in Minnesota, not in this special category, flight instructors at the school called the FBI the very next day. Wally Hillard and Rudy Deckers weren't even in the flight school business, we slowly discovered. These were not two guys forming a partnership to make a profit selling goods or services. The Deckers-Hillard partnership lost money from the first day it began. There was no hint it mattered to either man. It is widely known and confirmed by Hillard himself in filings at the Sarasota courthouse that the Naples financier lost between $5 and $7 million in his aviation partnerships with Deckers. But that was clearly all right with him, because when they bought Huffman Aviation, they were already losing sizable amounts of money every month at the first flight school they purchased in Naples. When they bought Huffman, they were already losing $40,000 a month on the Naples school, said Stuart Burkill, a former Hillard accountant. It was ridiculous. No one could understand why they'd want to double the pain. Their decision, to their own accountant, made no business sense. Whatever Deckers and Hillard were doing together during the 2 years and 6 months between the purchase of Huffman and the 9/11 attacks had nothing to do with prospering in business. Nor were Deckers and Hillard die-hard aviation enthusiasts using the flight schools as playthings or a hobby. Deckers was far too busy with a variety of illegal ventures to have been any sort of connoisseur of flight. And while the 70-year-old Wally Hillard is a pilot, he is an unfortunate tick that would seem to indicate that he could find a more suitable hobby than flying. He suffers from a narcoleptic condition which causes him to fall asleep at irregular intervals, while at the controls of airplanes he is flying, for example. So whatever their motivation for turning up at the Venice airport as new owners of Huffman Aviation, they weren't just two entrepreneurs looking to share in the glorious promise of free enterprise. The fact is, Rudy Deckers never made a dime teaching people to fly airplanes, and the legend of Rudy Deckers as flight school owner is a sham. This is important information in any real understanding of what happened on 9/11, because the controversial Deckers is not just a run-of-the-mill con man and quick-fading historical footnote. Deckers was at the critical nexus of the terrorist conspiracy. When Atta and Marwan made their fateful journey to America, when they arrived in Venice, it was Rudy Deckers assigning bunks on this side of the big pond. Records from his flight school were deemed sensitive enough to have merited being escorted back to Washington by Florida Governor Jeb Bush, aboard a C-130 cargo plane which left Sarasota less than 24 hours after the September 11th attack. So, if Hillard and Deckers weren't in the flight training business, what business were they in? What kind of business were they transacting while terrorists practiced touch and goes on the runways at the Venice airport? And why would someone go through the motions of pretending to be in business or pretending to be in a business they really weren't in? Where were we? Fuck. Here we go. The answer is simple, straightforward, and, we think, untimely, inescapable. Rudy Deckers and Wally Hillard used owning the two flight schools as cover for their other activities. The first person we asked about Deckers when we first arrived in Florida was a man who had recently been pressed back into service out of nearby MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa because his experience in the early 80s running Northern Alliance guys in Afghanistan was deemed useful. He had also been a troubleshooter during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. What he told us was chilling. Rudy's greedy, and when you're greedy, you can be useful for something, he muttered darkly. He would offer nothing further. Charlie Voss put it into perspective. In an interview on his front doorstep 6 months after the attack, Voss was the former Huffman Aviation bookkeeper who provided a place for Atta and Marwan to stay when they got to Venice. His house had been surrounded by reporters the day after the attack. Now things were quieter, and Charlie had some surprising things to say. Clearly, he'd been mulling over the same thing we had. When something doesn't make obvious business sense, he said, sometimes it's because things are being done for another reason that doesn't have a lot to do with dollars and cents. When we asked for a comment on his former boss, Deckers, he said his business did not add up. The business began with an article in the July 15, 1999 Sarasota Herald Tribune announcing the takeover of Huffman Aviation. Venice Municipal Airport's flight school and charter and aircraft maintenance services have swapped hands among Naples owners, who own a similar operation called Ambassador Airways at Naples Airport, said the paper. They bought the Venice business from Stanley Huffman of Naples, who founded the company 25 years ago. There were some odd anomalies in the circumstances surrounding the purchase of Huffman Aviation that occasioned comment out at the Venice airport. When Hillard and Deckers arrived brandishing a big roll and proceeding in short order to purchase the flight school, they paid such an inflated price for the business that it appeared to local aviation observers that money was no object. There was talk, rumors flew, they made the deal overnight, explained Coy Jacobs, who owns Mooney Aviation, a sales and maintenance facility right next door to Huffman Aviation. They just blew into town. They did no due diligence, to the best of my knowledge. That's a cardinal no-no. I mean, you don't just come in and buy a business like that overnight. He painted a picture of conditions at the time of the sale. Huffman was not for sale 3 days ago, said Jacob, and then Rudy shows up with Wally, who owns some Learjets. They were here a day or two, met with Stan Huffman. He named a number. They said yes and wrote him a check. And then they notified the city of Venice of what they had done after the fact. And that's the criteria, explained Jacob. You cannot transfer properties at this airport and most federally funded airports without the governing authority's approval. The sale was a shock to everybody at the airport. In fact, the city council, the city attorney, and I think, even for that matter, the manager of the airport, weren't even aware of it until well after the fact. If the city of Venice didn't approve the purchase, the two were stuck owning a business they couldn't run. They were taking a big financial gamble. What made the two men so confident that the local officials would bless the transaction? What had made them sure of getting government approval? When the sale was announced, Venice City Manager George Hunt told the gondolier he had not been officially notified of the purchase. "We wish Stan Huffman well, and we would welcome Ambassador Airways. They have a fine reputation in Naples." These are the first words out of Hunt's mouth about Rudy Deckers, and they're wrong. The only reputation Rudy Deckers enjoyed in Naples was a deadbeat and occasional scumbag. Rudy wasn't an unknown quantity there at all. He had a tarnished history, which the Venice city manager could have learned by picking up the phone and asking a few questions as we did. Time after time, we discovered that government entities had inexplicably smiled on the fortunes of Deckers and Hillard's aviation partnership until it began to seem as if they had a rich uncle in government somewhere. The FAA, for example, protected Deckers on a number of occasions. An aviation mechanic who worked for him told of criminal acts Deckers committed, which the mechanic had been forced by law to report to the FAA. 18,000 feet in the air. Safety is an important consideration, at least it's supposed to be. Rudy Deckers did an import of an airplane, the mechanic explained. We found dents on the front of a wing and replaced sheet metal, and then we found ribs that were crushed. This renders an airplane unworthy, and yet he still sold the plane. I turned Rudy Deckers into the FAA. They didn't do a damn thing. Another aviation mechanic who worked for Deckers over a period of years, Dave Montgomery, laughed when we asked him if this story could be true. Montgomery said when he found something wrong with an airplane, Deckers bought it. Deckers had fired him. Adding insult to injury, Deckers then bounced his last payroll check. John Villada, who managed Wally Hillard's huge jet fleet, confirmed Montgomery's story. Dave Montgomery worked for Rudy for 3 years as his chief mechanic till he found something wrong with an airplane Rudy bought. Rudy fired him and then bounced his last payroll check. Rudy Deckers' reputation at the Naples airport got so bad, we learned, that he couldn't even buy gas there for cash. When he bought Huffman Aviation for big bucks, he couldn't even pay rent at the Naples airport, said Naples Aviation executive. His reputation as a deadbeat was so bad that the local fixed base operator refused to sell him aviation fuel, even for cash. Deckers' reputation in Naples preceded him to Venice, except with government officials like Venice City Manager Hunt. Aviation business owner Coy Jacobs said people there knew he had been basically run out of the Naples airport. All we knew was that he was operating a flight school, an unsuccessful flight school in Naples. He had some run-ins with the FAA. I think he lost his license or had been reprimanded, said Jacob. A Naples aviation observer, Rob Tillman, confirmed Deckers' record of illegality there. They got busted by the FAA, crashed some airplanes, violated airspace enough to get grounded, charter airplanes with no license, you name it. And then there's the problem of Deckers's extensive business aviation experience cited by newspapers. Deckers didn't have any. I've always had some suspicions about the way he breezed into town out of nowhere, said someone close to the scene at Huffman. Just too many odd little things. He has, for example, absolutely no aviation background as far as anyone can tell. Breezed into town out of nowhere and no aviation background were not comments that square with portrayals of Deckers in news accounts about the purchase of the flight school, which stressed his broad aviation experience. Ambassador Airways owner Rudy Deckers, 42, Naples president, and Wally Hillard, 67, also from Naples, are both experienced pilots. Their Ambassador Airways owns several jet aircraft, including Lear jets, read one local news account. Owning a fleet of Lear jets may bestow a certain je ne sais quoi, but that hardly erases a colorful history of unscrupulous and illegal business practices. Deckers crossed the line with aviation professionals we spoke to. He put lives at risk to make a buck. He would take in people's planes to rent out while they were idle, one aviation mechanic who worked for him stated. Then he would come to me and want me to put switches on the Hobbs meter. It's like disconnecting an odometer on a car. It's a direct FAA violation and an extremely dangerous practice because you can no longer tell when the plane is due for service, the mechanic explained. But he wanted to do it because it let him rent out planes without having to pay the plane's owner their cut. Huffman was the only full-service fixed-base operator, or FBO, at the Venice airport. An FBO, or fixed-base operator, sells gas, provides mechanical services, and otherwise caters to private aviation, and is usually a center of activity at the airport. In other words, something of a civic resource. When Wally found Rudy Deckers, Deckers had already been thrown out of Naples as a con artist, said Naples Aviation Observer Rob Tillman. Plus, he had tax problems. He didn't pay tax on shit. And this is the guy whom Wally sold Florida Air. Who approved Deckers buying the FBO in Venice? Asked an irate aviation insider at the Venice airport. He'd been thrown out of Naples. How come they let him buy the Diamond of Venice? Rudy Deckers literally arrived with a bang at the newly purchased Huffman Aviation's headquarters, according to Charlie Voss. On his first day running the company, he took a girl into his office and noisily copulated with her on his desk, just to let everyone know that he was the new rooster in town. Everybody could hear them. It was disgusting. We found a number of people willing to talk about Deckers on the record. We heard from numerous sources that Rudy Deckers had been the object of a serious multi-agency federal investigation during the mid-90s. Apparently, authorities found a number of fruitful investigative leads to pursue. Rudy owned a computer business doing illegal activities at the Naples airport, explained Tillman. When Wally and Rudy were romancing, Rudy was smuggling aircraft back into the U.S. over the Arctic. International Computer Products was the name of Deckers' computer firm, active during the 1990s, we learned. Naples Aviation executive John Villada confirmed the accounts. There was a warrant for Rudy's arrest for smuggling computer chips, he told us. Both the DEA and U.S. Customs were interested in him back in 93 and 94. Everything he did from A to Z was illegal. A major source of conjecture around the airports in both Naples and Venice was what were the two partners doing together. They were considered an odd couple, universally, and so far we can tell, and so far as we can tell by observers at both airports. Daniel Clark was a French pilot who moved to Florida after spending 20 years as a flight instructor in Britain. She became Decker's and Hillard's flight manager at Ambassador Aviation. It was an unholy alliance, unless there was a reason for that alliance to be, she told us. They were just so incongruous. It was like watching the Pope and Saddam Hussein together. One of the big topics of conversation around the Naples airport was, what do you think about the Wally situation? We were all trying to figure out Wally's relationship with Rudy. They were like chalk and cheese. Nobody ever understood how they came together, but they were always together, said Clark. Amanda Keller used an American equivalent of chalk and cheese when she described seeing the corpulent Deckers and the sight Hillard together at Huffman. Said it right. It was funny to see the chubby guy and the little guy walking together. They were like Abbott and Costello or something. Rudy Deckers had an erratic sense of cash management that often led to speculation among aviation observers. He went from dead broke to flashing a big roll in the blink of an eye. Rudy would write a lot of bad checks, disappear for a while, and come back with a lot of cash, an airport observer recalled. Huffman Aviation was a little jewel when he bought it, and it had a really good reputation, another aviation executive told us. He took a profitable business and ran it right into the ground. So he's got a business that's losing money hand over fist, and yet he was awash in cash. It just doesn't add up right. I can recall times when Deckers owed money to everyone at the Naples airport, said a business owner there, and then he would leave town for 3 weeks or so in the Lear and come back flush. Rudy Decker's financial profile changed overnight, said Coy Jacob in Venice. Just about a year before he bought Huffman, he asked me for a ride from Venice to Naples, an airplane ride, which is maybe a 20-minute flight. I said, yeah, sure, I'll take you down there with one of my pilots if you buy the gas, Jacob related. He didn't even have the money to buy gas for an airplane to go down and back. And yet a year later he shows up and plops $1.7 million and $1.8 million or $2 million on the table as if it were paper money. I must skip the page. No? Yep. There we are. People who work in general aviation in Venice and Naples have a seemingly unlimited supply of stories portraying Deckers as a shady character. I spent 5 years working at an avionics shop in Naples, one aviation mechanic told us. There was a lot of things about the guy that just didn't add up. He claimed to me, for instance, that he's a New York cop. He even got a plaque on his wall with the words to that effect. A New York cop? You tell me. How does a Dutch con artist get a plaque claiming he's an officer with the New York Police Department? His question has been ringing in our ears for a long time. It was also, perhaps just coincidentally, the second reference to the NYPD we'd heard recently in Southwest Florida. The first had been when Amanda Keller recommended someone who can confirm a story about Mohomed Atta harassing her at work. The bouncer at Fantasies and Lingerie was a big bald guy named Nick, a retired NYC city detective, or a retired New York City detective. She said, you could talk to him. But Rudy Deckers was not the only Dutch national flight school owner at the Venice airport with curious and unexplained associations. The second magic Dutch boy could be equally mysterious, according to Coy Jacob. Arnie Kurithoff sat across from my desk one day and told me he had trained at a U.S. military installation in southeast Missouri, said Jacob. I'm from Missouri, and there aren't any military bases there training foreign nationals that I know of. But the thing I kept wondering was, what a Dutch national doing training at a What's a Dutch national doing training at a secure U.S. military facility? Deckers had a specific objective in mind when he came to Venice, witnesses said. He wanted to operate in complete privacy. I know that he, Deckers, wanted to buy out everybody on the block, so to speak, and he wanted to have a monopoly on the airport, Chief Flight Instructor Hammersley told us. That was one of his goals. Then I just saw it as a short Dutchman with a French complex called a Napoleon complex. Deckers and Hillard exhibited a particular secretiveness unusual in small-town businessmen. I flew down to Naples one day, and the deputy in charge of airport security said something funny, Coy Jacob told us. He said, Wally and Rudy never talk inside a building. They go out to an airplane and talk inside the plane. But it was Rudy Deckers we had heard came from people aware of his penchant for sexually harassing young female employees, some as young as 18, that removed any doubts about his character for us. I personally witnessed him sneak up behind this kid that worked for him and stick something that looked like a broom handle up the back of her skirt, stated one eyewitness angrily. And Deckers is a fat slob of a middle-aged guy. It was sick. Even though he's married, he was always after the young girls who worked for him to take little rides with him in his helicopter, always for a half an hour or so at a time. Deckers settled one lawsuit brought by Nicole Attini, an 18-year-old girl who used to work for him, the gondolier reported. Records were sealed. The settlement enjoined the girl to keep silent, which she did. But when the beefy Dutch national tried to renege on the settlement's terms, the young girl's attorney filed a motion to enforce the settlement agreement, and the sealed complaint became public information for the first time. It included contemporaneous notes taken by Nicole and painted a vivid portrait of life at Huffman Aviation during the time Atta and Marwan were there. As long as I worked at Huffman Aviation, I have been subjected to sexual harassment by Rudy Deckers, the girl told the court. Can I bite into you? Deckers asked her on one occasion, stated her notes. Told that he was sick. Deckers replied, I know, I just can't help it. Look at you, your hair, your face, your ass. You're a hot girl. On another occasion, the middle-aged Dutch national asked his young female employee, barely out of high school, if he could buy her. Buy me what? She responds. You know, just buy you. It should be like in the olden days. I should be able to just buy you, Deckers replied. In the same conversation, Deckers wondered aloud what the reaction would be if someone walked into his office while he was tucking his shirt back into his pants. Wouldn't that be funny if somebody walked in just now as I'm putting my shirt away, they would think I was fucking you. Once Deckers asked her, "Did you see that Russian girl I had in here? I couldn't hire her because she's Russian, but I did tell her I had a job for her." "In the pilot shop?" the young employee asked. "No, I told her she could give me a blowjob," Deckers replied. Deckers, the girl wrote, told her, "You're beautiful when you're mad," which she replied, "You have no right touching my pants." The young woman's allegations were confirmed by numerous other women who had close contact with him, including Amanda Keller, Mohomed Atta's former live-in girlfriend, who knew Deckers from waiting in the flight school lounge for Atta to land. "Rudy Deckers, he's a total pervert," she said, "a really nasty, nasty man. He said to me one time, 'What would it take for me to have a piece of you?' I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He said, 'Oh, come on, you know what I mean,' Keller told us. He's lucky Nicole, was the only one with enough nerve to sue him," said a woman close to Huffman executive. "He sexually harassed nearly every girl there, including the young 18-year-olds working in the restaurant. Almost everyone at the small Venice airport was aware of numerous allegations of sexual harassment against him." "Yeah, I heard that," Coy Jacobs stated, or said. That was the rumor around the airport. The airport is a small community. It's like a microcosm of society. Most airports are people. Women leave, and I've heard that there have been problems down there. His former office manager in Venice, Sue De Angelis, wouldn't be specific with her complaints about sexual harassment from her boss. She said she was thinking of suing herself. She was thinking of suing him herself. Okay, that makes sense. But she did say, a little grimly, "I put up with a lot of stuff from him. It was ugly. My experience with Rudy was unbelievable." One of Mohomed Atta's flight instructors at Huffman, Greg Woods, wrote to us about how hellish an experience it had been awaiting the bi-weekly arrival of a depraved cuckoo bird in his private helicopter, screaming insults at various employees, sexually harassing the proposedly chosen young and unsuspected office workers, and leaving everyone dazed and unbelieving at the upheaval of their routines. The man whose glib tale about the terrorist hijackers walking in his front door was the foundation for the FBI's story about them in this country is a liar, a cheat, and a thief. Yet the FBI expected the American people to believe him, because without Rudy Decker's testimony, the official story was back to square one. Maybe that's why he was interviewed by every NewsHour journalist in America. There was nary a hardball question from the lot of them. Nary, I guess never. Never a hardball question. Local newsmen observed that through it all, Deckers had been acting as unconcerned as a diplomat with a parking ticket. He acted like he had some kind of diplomatic immunity, Gondolier editor Bob Mudd said, shaking his head at the memory. Maybe Deckers did. Nothing about Deckers' rent status had changed by midsummer. The continuing saga made Huffman Aviation a regular item in local coverage. Huffman Rent Late Again headlined the Gondolier in late July. For the 6th straight month, Huffman Aviation Incorporated has failed to pay its rent to the city on time, read the account. When, less than a month before the September 11th tragedy, Rudy Deckers finally paid Huffman Aviation's rent. even that was considered newsworthy. Huffman pays rent, the paper headlined. It must have been good for a chuckle. But back when the gondolier was highlighting Rudy Decker's shortfall, it wasn't of interest except locally. No one thought to question Deckers about how he came to be suddenly flush with cash. He wasn't notorious yet, but when he first learned the news months after 9/11 that he had finally managed to pay Huffman Aviation's rent on time, our blood went cold. Because where did he come up with the money? If something changed in Rudy Decker's financial condition just 3 weeks before the attack, we wanted to see him hauled in for questioning. Another question was why Deckers, whose clients were forking over money than double the going rate for flight training, had always been late paying his rent. Even after collecting a terrorist surcharge, Deckers came up short. We weren't the only ones who wondered. Bill Warner, a private investigator in Sarasota probing so far unpublicized connections there are to the terrorist conspiracy, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. General Aviation has been in serious downturn since the attack at the Venice airport. It's been understandably even worse. Remember the stories about how Rudy Deckers had so much trouble coming up with rent at the airport, he asked. Rudy Deckers isn't having trouble paying rent anymore, he said, a little in awe of the implications of what he was saying. Less than a month before the September 11th attack, things changed for the better for flight school owner Deckers. Rudy finally got caught up on his rent. Imagine that. In the aftermath of the attack, while General Aviation suffered, every aviation concern at the airport was late at least once with their monthly rent. Every business but one. Before the attack, Rudy Decker's Huffman Aviation became a standing joke in Venice, Florida, because he couldn't pay the rent on time. But after the attack, even with the disastrous effect 9/11 had on general aviation, with every aviation concern at the airport missing payments, one business paid on time, and every month, like clockwork, Huffman Aviation. Where'd you get that money from, huh? We'll begin chapter 16, Rudy the Crook, tomorrow.